Now, an idle scan was developed about 4 years ago, and basically they came up with a new way to do a TCP port scan. Basically what it does is it lets you to do what's called blind port scanning, and this is where the attacker can actually scan the target without sending a single packet to the target from their own IP address. So the way this works is that most network servers are listening on TCP ports, like for instance web servers, which are going to listen on port 80, and mail servers are going to listen on port 25. A port is considered open if the application is listening on that port, otherwise it's considered closed. One way that you can determine whether or not the port is open is to send it a SYN, as we've seen in our previous examples. Now the target machine will send back a SYN ACK, which is the synchronize and the acknowledgement if the port's open, or it's going to send you back a reset if the port's closed. So a machine which receives an unsolicited SYN ACK packet will respond with a reset, and an unsolicited reset will be ignored. So every IP packet on the internet has what's called a fragmentation number, and many operating systems, in order to keep the communication go back and forth, just make sure that it increments this number with each transmission. So what I can do is I can probe to find out what this number is, and that will tell me whether or not or how many packets have been sent since the last probe. So the first thing I have to do to make the idle scan work is I have to have a zombie. In other words, I don't want to give away my location, so I'm going to make somebody else do the work for me. So I choose a zombie, and I basically send a SYN ACK to it and wait for it to send me back a response. When I get the response, I'm going to look at that IP ID number, and I'm going to note what that number is. Then what I do is I send a forged request, making it look like it came from the zombie. Now the request really comes from me, and I'm really sending a SYN packet from me, but I change the source IP to be the IP of my zombie. Then what happens is the target will send back a SYN ACK to my zombie, at which point the zombie can send back a reset to that one. Now, that's only if the port's open. If the port is closed, then of course what I'm going to get back is I'm going to get a reset that has come back from the target itself. Now, how do I determine whether or not that port is open? I go back and I take a look at that zombie PID again. In other words, I look for that IP ID number and I try to tell has it been incremented or not. Now, if that IP ID number has been incremented twice since I did my previous scan, then I know that, hey, I got back the response and then the SYN ACK and I sent a reset. However, if I check and that increment has only gone up by 1, then that means that the port is probably closed. In other words, whenever the SYN was sent, I did not receive, or I just received a reset back from the target machine itself. I can also do ICMP echo scanning, which is also sometimes called the list scan. Now basically what this does is it really doesn't scan any particular ports, because ICMP is really not used to establish the connections. But what I can do is I can go ahead and send it out and then just see which hosts are actually listening by pinging them with my ICMP packets. And one of the ways I can do this is with Nmap, and it makes it very easy. The list scan is a type of scan which automatically generates and prints out a list of these IPs or names without actually pinging or port scanning them. Now in this case, a DNS name resolution will also be carried out. So not only will I know the IP address, but I'll also know the name. So we've talked about half scans and SYN scans and stealth scans. Let's talk about a TCP Connect, or a full open scan. Now this is the best way to get the information, because what I'm going to do here, in addition to trying to go ahead and find out is the port listening, I'm going to go ahead and try to establish an open connection here. Now if the port's open, then my connect will be successful. If it's not open, then of course my open is not going to be successful. Another common way to scan is by using an FTP bounce scan. This is a type of port scanning which makes use of the bounce attack on FTP servers. Basically what happens is this vulnerability allows a person to send a request that the FTP server open a connection to the third party. So in other words, instead of me doing the scan on the third party, I'm forcing the FTP server to do the actual scan and send back those results. Now this bounce attack is similar to IP spoofing, but it's a little bit different. But the main point is I can keep my identity a secret. Now it's very hard to trace, and it does permit access to local networks, and of course since I'm going to the FTP server, I have already gotten through their firewall at this stage. So basically I create and I send my FTP commands to the FTP server, and then I force that server to go ahead and perform its scanning. Now with the send finish scan, I can use IP fragments. And it's really not a different method of scanning, but it's just a modification. So basically what happens is a TCP header can be split into several packets. And the reason I do this is by splitting it into multiple packets, sometimes the filters can't really tell what's in that packet. So the filters will allow those packets to get through. Now that's TCP IP scanning. How about UDP scanning? I can do UDP raw scanning. In this case, I basically send UDP instead of using TCP. Now, it's a little bit simpler to do so, but it's also a little bit more difficult, because basically the protocol does not require a connection. Now, if I happen to be using Linux, I could use a UDP receive from scanning. And what this does is when non-root users can't read the port unreachable errors directly, Linux will actually inform me that they at least have been received. Now this is a technique sometimes I'm going to go ahead and use to scan by non-root users. Another type of scan is called a reverse ident scan, and in this case I use the ident protocol, and what the ident protocol will allow me to do is disclose the username of the owner of the process connected via TCP IP, even if that process did not initiate the connection. So I can go ahead and establish a connection on an HTTP port, and then I can use ident to find out whether that server is running as a root. Now, I can only do this with a full TCP connection to the target port, but once I make that connection, then I can go ahead and use ident to find out that information. Another type of scan that can be used is the RCP scan. Basically, this is used in combination with some other scans. And basically what I do is I scan for all TCP and UDP ports, and then I flood them with, in this case, the Sun RPC program null commands. And this will let me find out whether or not they are RPC ports. Now if they are RPC, or remote procedure call ports, then I can do a lot with them. In fact, I can actually find out what version number and what programs they're actually listening for.